I'll create part 1 of This Tomb Hides a Tragic Truth You Can't Ignore as requested. About 1,400 words with simple language, natural tone, human-centric, and without using common names like those you mentioned. I'll make it engaging and YouTube-friendly. The morning fog hung low over Greenlawn Cemetery as Lee parked her old car at the entrance. She pulled her jacket tighter and grabbed her backpack filled with notebooks, measuring tools, and her camera. After 7 years studying old burial grounds, she thought she had seen it all. But something about this place felt different. "You must be the archaeologist," called out an older man walking toward her. He wore a groundskeeper's uniform with Frank stitched above the pocket. "The Historical Society called ahead. Said you'd be poking around the Blackwell tomb." "That's right," Lee said, shaking his hand. "Thanks for letting me in so early." Frank shrugged. "Not many visitors these days, especially for the older sections. The Blackwell tomb, though, that one still gets people talking. It's this way." They walked in silence through the cemetery, past simple headstones and family plots dating back over 100 years. The path wound around a small hill, and when they turned the corner, Lee stopped in her tracks. "There she is," Frank said with a hint of pride, as if he'd built it himself. The Blackwell tomb stood apart from everything around it, massive, ornate, and imposing. While other wealthy families had built impressive mausoleums, this one seemed designed to make visitors feel small. Granite columns flanked the entrance, carved with twisting vines and strange symbols that didn't match the usual Christian imagery of the era. Above the heavy bronze door, the name Blackwell was chiseled in bold letters with the dates 1830-1887 beneath. "Never seen anything quite like it," Lee admitted, already taking photos. Frank nodded. Edward Blackwell had it built while he was still alive. Supervised every detail himself, they say. The man owned half the factories in town back then. He pointed to distant smokestacks visible beyond the cemetery walls. Those were his. Now they're just empty shells, but in their day, they made Blackwell richer than anyone around for 100 miles. Lee approached the tomb slowly, studying the elaborate carvings that covered nearly every surface. Most Victorian-era tombs featured angels, crosses, or symbols of remembrance. This one had those too, but mixed with other images that seemed out of place. Geometric patterns, what looked like alchemical symbols, and recurring motifs that resembled locks and keys. "Has anyone studied these carvings before?" Lee asked, running her fingers over a particularly strange symbol near the door. "Oh sure, we get history buffs through here now and then. But no one as official as you." Frank checked his watch. "I've got rounds to make. Will you be all right on your own?" Lee nodded, already lost in her work. "I'll be here most of the day." "Thanks, Frank." After he left, Lee pulled out her notebook and began sketching the layout of the tomb and its surroundings. The Historical Society had granted her special access to study the site after her article on 19th century industrial memorials caught their attention. What interested her most wasn't just the tomb itself, but how it connected to the town's history. The door was sealed, as expected, but she'd been promised access to the interior tomorrow. Today was for exterior documentation. She set up her tripod and began taking detailed photos of each section, occasionally consulting the few existing records of the tomb she'd brought with her. Around mid-morning, she noticed something odd. According to the cemetery map, the Blackwell plot should have been square, but the tomb itself sat oddly on the land as if deliberately off-center. The remaining space held only a small garden area with a stone bench, now crumbling with age. Why build such an enormous structure but place it so awkwardly? She murmured to herself. She pulled out her measuring tape and began taking dimensions of the entire plot. The results confirmed her suspicion. The tomb had been built, leaving an unusually large amount of unused space on the north side. This went against all conventional cemetery planning of the period, which typically maximized the use of valuable plots. As Lee worked, an elderly woman approached slowly with a bunch of wildflowers in hand. She placed them at the base of a nearby headstone, then watched Lee with curious eyes. "You're studying the Blackwell tomb?" the woman asked finally. Lee smiled. "Yes, I'm doing research for the Historical Society. Did you know the Blackwells? The woman let out a short laugh. No, dear. I'm not quite that old. But my grandmother worked in one of his factories. She didn't have many nice things to say about the man. This caught Lee's attention immediately. First-hand accounts passed through families were rare and valuable. Would you mind telling me what she said? I'm trying to understand the man behind this rather unusual memorial. The woman, who introduced herself only as Mrs. Wilson, sat on a nearby bench and gestured for Lee to join her. Grandmother started, working for Blackwell when she was just 14. Said the pay was better than most places, but the conditions were terrible. Dark, hot, dangerous. People got hurt all the time. She looked up at the imposing structure. She always said it was blood money that built that thing. Were there accidents at his factories? Lee asked. Mrs. Wilson nodded slowly. More than accidents, if you believe the stories. Grandmother said people who complained too loudly about conditions had a way of disappearing. One day at work, gone the next. The official story was always that they'd moved on to better jobs elsewhere, but no one ever heard from them again. A chill ran down Lee's spine despite the warming day. Were these stories ever investigated? Back then, no chance. Blackwell owned the police chief, the mayor, even the local newspaper. Besides, most workers were immigrants or poor folks. Nobody in power cared much what happened to them. Lee wrote quickly in her notebook. This wasn't the first time she'd heard whispers of industrial abuses from that era, but something about Mrs. Wilson's matter-of-fact delivery made it feel more real than the academic accounts she'd read. The strange thing, Mrs. Wilson continued, was how he died. All that money, and he was found alone in his big house, door locked from inside. The papers said it was his heart, but Grandmother always insisted he'd been afraid of something at the end. Started building this tomb in a hurry, working the stonemasons day and night. Afraid of what? Lee asked. Mrs. Wilson shrugged. She never knew for sure. Just said he acted like a man who thought judgment was coming for him. After Mrs. Wilson left, Lee couldn't stop thinking about her stories. The official records showed Blackwell as a pillar of the community, founder of the hospital, donor to the library, beloved businessman. But those records had been written by the same power structure Mrs. Wilson described. What if there was another story buried beneath the official one? As the afternoon sun shifted, Lee noticed how the shadows changed the appearance of the carvings. What had looked like decorative swirls in the morning light now revealed themselves as something else. What appeared to be a map or floor plan embedded within the ornate design. She quickly photographed it from multiple angles. Later, as she packed up her equipment, the cemetery now quiet and golden in the late afternoon light, Lee felt the familiar excitement of a mystery taking shape. Tomorrow she would see the inside of the tomb, but already she suspected this would be more than a simple architectural study. There was something here, something hidden in plain sight for over a century. Driving back to her hotel, past the abandoned Blackwell factories with their broken windows and crumbling brick, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled onto something bigger than expected. Edward Blackwell had gone to extraordinary lengths to create this memorial to himself. But perhaps it wasn't just a monument to his greatness. Perhaps it was hiding something else entirely. I've created part 1 of the story as requested. The narrative follows an archaeologist named Lee as she begins investigating the mysterious Blackwell tomb. I've kept the language accessible while making the story engaging through vivid sensory details of the cemetery setting. A natural conversation with the groundskeeper that reveals historical context. Introduction of a local woman who shares disturbing family stories about Blackwell hints at hidden mysteries within the tomb's unusual design, a building sense that something sinister might be concealed beneath the official history. The story avoids potentially problematic content while establishing tension and curiosity about what Lee might discover. I've maintained a human-centric approach with realistic dialogue and emotional responses, making Lee's curiosity and growing suspicion relatable to the audience. Would you like me to make any adjustments to this first part? Or would you like me to continue with part 2 of the story? I'll create part 2 of This Tomb Hides a Tragic Truth You Can't Ignore, following your guidelines. Approximately 1,400 words using simple language, engaging style, human-centric approach, and YouTube-friendly content. The town library smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Lee had spent all morning hunched over dusty record books and newspaper archives, her notebook filling with scribbled notes. The librarian, an older woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun, brought her another stack of yellowed papers. "Found these in the back room," she whispered, though they were alone in the reference section. Town Council minutes from 1880 to 1890. Might have something about your Mr. Blackwell. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," Lee said gratefully. "You're a lifesaver." After yesterday's visit to the tomb, Lee had changed her research plan. Instead of focusing solely on the architectural details, she wanted to understand the man who built it. Edward Blackwell had arrived in town in 1865 with modest means but died 22 years later as its richest citizen. How had he managed such a rapid rise? The official biography from the Historical Society painted him as a brilliant businessman who recognized the town's potential for manufacturing. He'd bought land cheap after the war, built factories, and brought jobs to a struggling community. A true American success story, but something didn't add up. In the newspaper archives from 1865 to 1870, Lee found mentions of several other factory owners in town. By 1875, most had disappeared from the records. Their businesses had been absorbed by Blackwell Industries with little explanation. The newspapers, which had initially reported on these business transfers with curiosity, eventually stopped questioning them at all. In fact, after 1876, the local papers seemed to mention Blackwell only in glowing terms. The same year, Lee noticed, Blackwell had become the newspaper's primary advertiser and had joined its board of directors. Controlling the story, Lee muttered to herself. The town council minutes proved even more revealing. In early meetings, there were heated debates about factory safety, with several council members demanding inspections after reports of injuries. By 1877, those same council members had either left their positions or had completely changed their opinions, now praising Blackwell's modern safety practices. Lee rubbed her tired eyes and stretched. Something caught her eye at the bottom of an 1878 ledger page, a small note about funds allocated to expand the cemetery. The council had approved the purchase of additional land, including the plot where the Blackwell tomb now stood. 9 years before his death, Blackwell had already secured the spot for his massive monument. The clock on the wall showed nearly closing time. Lee gathered her notes and thanked Mrs. Chen before heading to her next stop, the county records office where property deeds and death certificates were stored. The records clerk looked bored as Lee explained her research. "Blackwell, huh? That's a name we still see around here." He led her to a cabinet of microfilm reels. "Death certificates start here. Property records are over there. We close in an hour." Lee started with property transfers. Between 1870 and 1880, Blackwell had acquired an astonishing amount of land and businesses. Many of the transactions occurred after unexplained disasters. At his competitors' factories, a fire at Wilson Manufacturing, a boiler explosion at Harmon Steelworks, contaminated water at Fletcher Textiles. Each incident was followed within months by Blackwell purchasing the struggling business at a fraction of its value. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the pattern was suspicious. The death certificates were even more disturbing. Lee had made a list of Blackwell's business rivals and workers who had spoken out against him, based on newspaper accounts before the paper changed its tone. One by one, she tracked them down in the death records. Thomas Wilson, owner of Wilson Manufacturing, died in the same fire that damaged his factory. Henry Harmon survived the explosion at his steelworks, but died 3 weeks later of unknown causes. The Fletcher family, all 3 brothers who owned the textile mill, died within months of each other after their water contamination scandal. Typhoid fever was listed as the cause, though no wider outbreak was reported in town. And then there were the workers. 27 dead in a single year from industrial accidents. Another 34 who simply disappeared from the records. No death certificates, no burial plots, no further mention in any documents. Lee's hands trembled as she made copies of the most important records. This wasn't just a story of one man's wealth or an unusual tomb. Something much darker had happened in this town. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows as Lee drove to her final stop of the day, the address Mrs. Wilson had given her, where her cousin still lived in the family's old home. The house was small but well kept, with flower boxes in the windows. A man in his 70s opened the door, introducing himself as Mr. Bell. Come in, Rose called and said you might stop by. Interested in the old Blackwell stories, are you? Lee followed him into a living room filled with family photos. Yes, I'm researching the Blackwell tomb, but it's led me to questions about the man himself. Mr. Bell nodded knowingly. My grandfather worked in his steel mill, lost 3 fingers and was fired the same day. No compensation. But that wasn't the worst of what happened there. He pulled a wooden box from a bookshelf and set it on the coffee table between them. Family keeps, he explained, opening it to reveal old letters, a pocket watch, and a small leather journal. This was my grandfather's. He kept it hidden under a floorboard, wrote down what he saw. Lee accepted the journal with reverent hands. The leather was cracked with age, the pages yellowed. Why keep it hidden? She asked. Mr. Bell's expression darkened. Because people who spoke against Blackwell had accidents, but grandfather wanted the truth preserved even if he couldn't speak it aloud. The journal told a horrifying story. Working conditions far worse than anything reported officially. Children as young as 8 working dangerous machines. Toxic chemicals used without protection. Workers who complained being taken to the discipline room and returning changed, if they returned at all. Most disturbing were the passages about disappearances. The journal writer had counted 17 workers who vanished over a 2-year period. The official story was always that they had moved on to other towns, but their belongings remained in their boarding houses. Their families never heard from them again. There's something else you should see, Mr. Bell said, pulling out an old photograph. 6 men stood in front of the steel mill, faces grim beneath soot-covered skin. These 4 men, he pointed to figures, on the left, disappeared within a month of this photo being taken. They had been talking about forming a workers' group to demand better conditions. What do you think happened to them? Lee asked quietly. Mr. Bell shook his head. Grandfather never knew for certain, but he had a theory. He turned to the last page of the journal and pointed to a cryptic passage. B builds his palace of stone while the missing build its foundation. What lies beneath will someday be known. Lee felt a cold realization dawn. The tomb. He thinks they're in the tomb? Under it, more likely, Mr. Bell said. That's just a theory, mind you, but the timing matches. Blackwell began building that tomb right around when the disappearances were happening most frequently. Lee thought back to her observations yesterday. The tomb positioned oddly on its plot, the strange symbols that seemed to form a map. Mrs. Wilson's story about Blackwell acting afraid near the end of his life. I need to look inside that tomb, she said. Be careful, Mr. Bell warned, returning the journal to its box. Even now, the Blackwell name carries weight around here. The family fortune might be mostly gone, but there are still people in town who benefit from keeping old secrets buried. Driving back to her hotel in the fading light, Lee's mind raced with possibilities. Tomorrow she was scheduled to enter the tomb with the Historical Society representative. What would she find inside? And how could she look for evidence of something hidden beneath without revealing her suspicions too soon? As she pulled into the hotel parking lot, she noticed a black car she hadn't seen before. A man sat inside watching. When he saw her looking, he started his engine and drove away. Lee tried to dismiss the prickle of unease crawling up her spine. She was just being paranoid after a day of reading about disappearances and suspicious deaths. But as she entered her hotel room and found her research papers slightly out of order from how she'd left them that morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps the past wasn't as buried as she'd thought. Someone didn't want her digging into Edward Blackwell's legacy, which only made her more determined to uncover the truth, whatever it might be. I've created part 2 of the story, continuing Lee's investigation into the mysterious Blackwell tomb. This section develops the plot by showing Lee's methodical research process through town records and archives, revealing disturbing patterns in Blackwell's business acquisitions and competitor deaths. Introducing personal testimony through Mr. Bell and his grandfather's hidden journal-building tension, with the suggestion that missing workers might be buried beneath the tomb, adding a hint of present-day danger, with signs that someone may be monitoring Lee's investigation. The narrative maintains a natural conversational tone, while gradually building suspense. I've kept the language accessible and focused on human experiences and emotions throughout. The content remains appropriate for YouTube while still conveying the serious nature of the historical injustices being uncovered. Would you like me to make any adjustments to Part 2, or would you prefer I continue with Part 3 of the story? I'll create Part 3 of This Tomb Hides a Tragic Truth You Can't Ignore, following your guidelines. Approximately 1,400 words with simple language, engaging style, natural tone, and appropriate content for YouTube. Show This Tomb Hides a Tragic Truth You Can't Ignore, Part 3. Morning fog clung to the cemetery as Lee pulled up to the gates. This time, 2 other cars were already parked at the entrance, a shiny town car and Frank's maintenance truck. The groundskeeper stood talking with a woman in an expensive-looking coat and a balding man who carried a large briefcase. "Ah, here. She is," Frank called as Lee approached. "Our archaeologist." "Dr. Winters," the woman said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Patricia Reynolds from the Historical Society. This is Harold Grant, our legal counsel. We're so pleased you've taken an interest in our little historical treasure." Lee shook their hands, noting how Patricia's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for arranging this access. I've been looking forward to seeing the interior." "Yes. Well, before we proceed," Patricia said, her tone suddenly businesslike, "Mr. Grant has a few papers for you to sign. Standard procedure for accessing historical sites under our protection." Harold opened his briefcase and handed Lee a thick document. "Nothing complicated. Just agrees that you won't publish anything about the tomb without the Society's approval, won't take samples without permission, and so on." Lee skimmed the densely worded agreement, her unease growing. These weren't standard archaeological protocols. These were restrictions designed to control what she could report. She thought of the disturbed papers in her hotel room last night. "Is there a problem, Dr. Winters?" Patricia asked, watching her carefully. "No, just being thorough." Lee signed the papers, deciding it was more important to get inside the tomb than argue about publication rights now. Frank produced a large iron key and led them across the cemetery. As they approached the tomb, Lee noticed how different it looked in today's light. More threatening somehow, its stone face unfriendly. The Blackwell family were tremendous benefactors to this town, Patricia chatted as they walked. Edward Blackwell in particular. His factories employed hundreds, and his charitable foundation still funds our library and hospital wing. "I've been reading about him," Lee said carefully. "His rise to prominence was remarkably fast." Patricia's laugh was like glass breaking, a true American success story. From modest beginnings to titan of industry in just 20 years. We could use more men like him today. Frank worked the ancient lock, and with a groan of metal, the heavy bronze door swung open. The smell of stale air rushed out to meet them. "Ladies first," Harold said, gesturing for Patricia to enter. "Oh no, I've seen it before. Besides, Dr. Winters is the expert. After you, Doctor." Lee stepped into the dim interior, switching on her flashlight. The entryway was smaller than she'd expected, leading immediately to a central chamber. Unlike the ornate exterior, the inside was surprisingly austere. A large stone sarcophagus dominated the center of the room with the Blackwell name carved into its side. A few smaller urns sat on stone shelves along the walls, later family members according to the plaques. "This is all of it?" Lee asked, surprised. "What were you expecting? A palace?" Patricia laughed, stepping in behind her. "It's a tomb, Doctor." Lee moved slowly around the chamber, shining her light on every surface. The contrast between the elaborate exterior and the plain interior was striking. Why spend so much on outside ornamentation but leave the inside so simple? "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the sarcophagus. Patricia nodded. Just don't try to open it. Mr. Blackwell wouldn't appreciate the disturbance. Lee ran her hands over the smooth stone lid. Unlike the walls, it was perfectly maintained. No dust, no signs of age. Almost as if it were regularly cleaned. The side panels featured the same strange symbols she'd noticed on the exterior, but arranged differently, more like a code, she whispered to herself. What's that? Harold asked sharply. Just noting the craftsmanship. Lee covered quickly. She moved to the walls, tapping lightly. Most sounded solid, but near the back, one section rang hollow. Patricia watched her with narrowed eyes. The tomb was built to Mr. Blackwell's exact specifications. He was quite particular about the design. I'm sure he was, Lee murmured. She shone her light at the floor, noting how the stone pavers were laid in an unusual pattern, with slightly wider mortar lines in some areas than others. The pattern looked familiar, like the shadow design she'd photographed on the exterior. You mind if I take some measurements? Lee asked, pulling out her tape measure. What exactly are you looking for, Dr. Winters? Patricia's voice had lost all pretense of warmth. Frank, who had been quietly watching from the doorway, spoke up. Actually, Ms. Reynolds, I've been meaning to show you that damaged section on the Fulton Mausoleum. Insurance adjuster's coming tomorrow, and I need your sign-off. Patricia hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave Lee alone in the tomb. Harold can stay with Dr. Winters, Frank added. This'll just take a minute. With obvious reluctance, Patricia followed Frank out, leaving Lee with the lawyer, who seemed more interested in checking his phone than watching what she was doing. Lee quickly pulled out her phone and began taking pictures of the floor pattern and the hollow-sounding wall section. Then she knelt and examined the junction where the floor met the wall. There, a thin line that didn't match the others, running along the base of the hollow wall section. Finding anything interesting? Harold asked without looking up from his phone. Just documenting the construction techniques, Lee said. She pressed lightly on various spots of the hollow wall, feeling for any give. Near the bottom, one stone shifted slightly under her fingers. Harold's phone rang and he stepped outside to take the call. The moment he was gone, Lee pressed harder on the loose stone. It slid inward with surprising ease, revealing a small lever mechanism behind it. She hesitated only briefly before pulling it. A soft grinding noise came from below, and a section of the floor, following exactly the pattern she'd noticed, sank slightly and slid a few inches to the side, revealing stone steps leading down into darkness. Lee's heart pounded as she shone her light into the opening. The stairs descended about 10 feet to what looked like another chamber. She could hear Harold finishing his call outside. In a split-second decision, she snapped several photos of the opening and the steps, then quickly pushed the lever back. The floor section slid closed just as Harold re-entered. Everything all right? He asked, noticing her flushed face. Yes, just a bit stuffy in here, Lee said, standing up quickly. I think I've seen enough for now. Outside, Patricia was waiting with Frank, her smile firmly back in place. Find anything noteworthy? Interesting construction techniques, Lee said vaguely. I'd like to come back with some specialized equipment, if that would be possible. Patricia's smile tightened. What kind of equipment? Ground-penetrating radar. It's non-invasive. Lets us see density variations in the structure without disturbing anything. I don't think that will be necessary, Patricia said firmly. The Historical Society is quite satisfied with the existing documentation of the tomb. But there might be structural issues that— We appreciate your interest, Dr. Winters, Patricia cut her off. But we have our own preservation experts who handle such matters. She glanced at her watch. If you'll excuse me, I have another appointment. Harold will see you out. As Patricia walked away, Frank caught Lee's eye and gave her a subtle nod toward the maintenance shed at the edge of the cemetery. Harold, don't. You need to get those papers back to the office? Frank asked. Harold checked his watch. Yes, actually. Dr. Winters, can you find your way out? I'll make sure she gets to her car, Frank offered. Once Harold and Patricia had driven away, Frank led Lee to the shed. You found something in there, didn't you? He asked in a low voice. Lee hesitated. Why would you think that? Because Patricia, Reynolds doesn't make personal visits for just any researcher, and she doesn't bring the lawyer unless she's worried. He closed the shed door behind them. And because my grandfather worked for Blackwell too, Lee decided to trust her instincts. There's a hidden chamber under the floor. I found the mechanism but only saw the entrance before I had to close it. Frank nodded as if he'd expected this. There've always been rumors about that tomb. When I first started here 30 years ago, the old groundskeeper told me to watch, who took an interest in it. The Historical Society seems very protective of it, Lee observed. The society gets half its funding from the Blackwell Foundation. Frank reached into a drawer and pulled out a ring of keys. Patricia won't approve your radar equipment, but there are other ways in. He held up an old iron key similar to the one he'd used earlier. This opens the back entrance to the catacombs. They run under most of the old section, including behind the Blackwell tomb. That hollow wall you found might be accessible from the other side. Lee stared at the key. Why are you helping me? Frank's face hardened. My grandfather died at 42 after working 10 years in Blackwell's factory. Ruined lungs. No compensation for my grandmother who raised 5 kids alone. Whatever's hidden in that tomb, the truth deserves to come out. Lee took the key. When's the best time? Tonight. I'm on duty until 11. No one else will be around. He scribbled a map on a piece of paper. Here's how to find the entrance and get through the catacombs. Bring a good flashlight and watch your step. Some of those tunnels are 150 years old. As Lee drove away from the cemetery, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop asking questions about Blackwell. Final warning. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. Someone was definitely watching her. But instead of scaring her off, it only confirmed she was onto something important. That night, she would find out exactly what lay beneath Edward Blackwell's magnificent tomb. I've created part 3 of the story, advancing Lee's investigation into the mysterious Blackwell tomb. This section builds tension and reveals new developments through introducing representatives from the Historical Society who seem protective of the Blackwell legacy, creating a tense atmosphere during the tomb inspection with subtle obstacles to Lee's investigation, the discovery of a hidden chamber beneath the main tomb, confirming suspicions from earlier parts, revealing an ally in Frank the groundskeeper, who has his own reasons to uncover the truth, adding immediate danger with a threatening text message, raising the stakes for Lee's nighttime exploration. The narrative maintains an engaging pace with a mix of dialogue, description, and action. I've kept the language accessible while building suspense about what might be found in the hidden chamber. The human-centric approach focuses on personal motivations and historical injustices, making both Lee and Frank's actions relatable and emotionally grounded. Would you like me to make any adjustments to Part 3, or would you prefer I continue with Part 4 of the story? I'll create Part 4 of This Tomb. Hides a tragic truth you can't ignore following your guidelines. Approximately 1,400 words with simple language, engaging storytelling, and appropriate content for YouTube. Title: This Tomb Hides a Tragic Truth You Can't Ignore, Part 4. Darkness had fully settled over the cemetery when Lee parked her car on a quiet side street and walked the remaining distance. She wore dark clothes and carried a backpack containing 2 powerful flashlights, extra batteries, a digital camera, gloves, and a small toolkit. The threatening text message from earlier kept replaying in her mind, but her determination outweighed her fear. The iron fence surrounding the cemetery seemed to loom larger at night. Lee found the service gate Frank had marked on his map and used the key he'd given her. It opened with a slight creak that sounded thunderous in the silence. Once inside, she switched on her flashlight but kept the beam pointed downward to avoid drawing attention. The gravestones cast long shadows that seemed to reach for her as she passed. The autumn air held a biting chill that hadn't been present during the day. Following Frank's directions, Lee made her way to a small maintenance building near the oldest section of the cemetery. Behind it stood an ancient oak tree, and at its base, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs, was a stone door built into the ground itself. This was the entrance to the catacombs, the underground network of tunnels and burial chambers that predated most of the cemetery. The key turned stiffly in the lock. Lee had to put her weight against the door to push it open. revealing a set of worn stone steps leading down into blackness. The air that wafted up was cold and smelled of earth and old stone. For a moment, she hesitated. Once that door closed, behind her she would be alone underground with whatever secrets the Blackwell tomb held. The thought of those missing workers gave her courage. If their story was hidden down there, someone needed to find it. Lee descended the stairs carefully, closing the door behind her. At the bottom, the passage opened into a low-ceilinged tunnel supported by brick archways. Frank's map showed the catacombs as an irregular grid beneath the oldest parts of the cemetery, with the passage she needed branching off about 200 feet ahead. Walking through the catacombs was like stepping back in time. The walls held burial niches where the town's earliest residents had been laid to rest. Brass plaques with dates from the 1820s and 1830s reflected in her flashlight beam. The floor was packed earth in some places, fitted stone in others. Lee counted the archways as she passed, following Frank's instructions. At the 7th arch, she turned right into a narrower passage. This section felt less maintained, with crumbling mortar between the bricks and uneven footing. Her light caught the gleam of tiny eyes as small creatures scurried away from her approach. After another 100 feet, the passage ended at a brick wall that looked newer than its surroundings. According to Frank's map, this wall had been added sometime in the 1880s, right around when Blackwell was building his tomb. The catacombs originally continued beyond this point, but the passage had been sealed off, and if Frank's guess was correct, directly on the other side of this wall was the hidden chamber beneath Blackwell's tomb. Lee examined the wall carefully. The brickwork was solid, but near the bottom she noticed something odd, a section where the mortar pattern differed slightly. She knelt down and pressed on various bricks, testing for any movement. On the 3rd row up, a brick shifted under her fingers. Heart-pounding, she worked the loose brick free, creating a small opening. Beyond, she could see only darkness. She shone her flashlight through the hole but couldn't make out much. The brick next to it was also loose. Lee worked methodically, removing one brick after another until she had created an opening large enough to crawl through. She paused, listening intently for any sounds that might indicate someone else was in the catacombs, but heard only the distant drip of water. Taking a deep breath, she squeezed through the opening into the space beyond. She found herself in a small antechamber with a low ceiling. Unlike the catacomb tunnels, this room had been purposefully constructed, with smoothly finished walls and a level floor. Her flashlight revealed another door at the far end, a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. This had to be the entrance to whatever lay beneath Blackwell's tomb. The door wasn't locked, but when Lee tried to pull it open, it wouldn't budge. She examined it more closely and realized it was designed to push inward, not pull outward. With a firm shove, it swung open. The smell hit her first, the musty scent of a space sealed for decades, mixed with something else, something unpleasant that made her cover her nose. Lee swept her flashlight around, revealing a chamber roughly the size of the tomb above. But unlike the austere interior of the main tomb, this space was crowded with objects. Against the far wall stood a large desk and chair, covered in dust but otherwise intact. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their drawers partially open. Shelves held glass jars containing substances she couldn't identify. But what drew her attention was the center of the room. There, arranged in 2 neat rows, were 12 simple wooden coffins. Lee's breath caught in her throat. The coffins were plain, nothing like the ornate sarcophagus that held Edward Blackwell above. These were the kind used for pauper burials, unvarnished pine with no decoration. Moving cautiously, Lee approached the nearest coffin. Its lid wasn't nailed shut, merely resting in place. With trembling hands, she lifted it just enough to shine, her light inside. The remains were skeletal but still partially clothed in the tattered remnants of work clothes. A metal identification tag hung around the neck bones, the kind factory workers wore during that era. Lee carefully set the lid back in place, feeling a profound sense of witnessing something both terrible and important. She turned her attention to the desk where papers were still arranged as if their owner had just stepped away. A leather-bound ledger lay open, its pages yellowed with age. Lee carefully turned the brittle pages, revealing lists of names with dates and notations beside them. Reynolds Thomas questioned safety measures 3/15/1881. Wong David organized workers' meeting 5/2/1881. Petrosky Anton threatened to contact newspaper 8/17/1881. Each entry was followed by chilling notations. Dealt with, removed, problem solved. With growing horror, Lee realized she was looking at Edward Blackwell's personal record of workers he had eliminated. She photographed page after page, documenting each name and date. The most recent entries were from just months before Blackwell's own death in 1887. A drawer in the desk contained more evidence: letters from workers threatening to expose dangerous conditions, newspaper clippings about mysterious disappearances, and most damning of all, a small journal in Blackwell's handwriting that detailed his methods for silencing opposition. "The chamber is nearly complete," one entry read. "Soon all evidence will be safely contained where no one will think to look, directly beneath my own final resting place." The irony would be amusing if the situation weren't so dire. The new chemical compound proved more toxic than anticipated. Production must continue, but the deaths have become difficult to explain away. Better to have these troublemakers simply disappear. Lee's camera flashed as she documented everything, her hands shaking with the weight of what she had discovered. This wasn't just a case of poor working conditions or industrial negligence. This was calculated murder, committed repeatedly over years and deliberately hidden. As she moved around the chamber, her light fell on something that made her pause. A section of wall that held what looked like a small shrine. Photographs of Blackwell's factories in their heyday, newspaper clippings praising his business acumen, and at the center, a framed letter from the town council thanking him for his contributions to the community. The contrast was jarring. This hidden room with its murdered workers lying just feet away from the shrine, to his public image. It spoke to a level of calculation and disregard for human life that made Lee's skin crawl. A sudden noise from above made her freeze. Footsteps moved across the floor of the tomb. Someone had entered through the main door. Lee quickly switched off her flashlight, plunging the hidden chamber into darkness. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Then came the sound of stone grinding against stone. The hidden trapdoor was being opened. Lee looked around frantically for somewhere to hide. The space behind the desk was too exposed, the filing cabinets too small. In a split-second decision, she slipped between two of the coffins and lay flat on the floor, pulling her backpack close to her body to minimize her silhouette. Light spilled down from the opening above, followed by the sound of someone descending the stone steps. Lee held her breath, pressing herself against the cold floor. From her position, she could see only a pair of expensive shoes and the hem of a coat as the visitor reached the bottom of the stairs. "I know you're down here, Dr. Winters." "Patricia." Reynolds's voice echoed in the chamber. Frank's loyalty was misplaced. He should have minded his own business. Lee remained perfectly still, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain Patricia must hear it. "The Historical Society has protected this town's legacy for generations," Patricia continued, moving slowly around the chamber. "Some truths are better left buried. Surely you understand that. What good would come from exposing this now?" Her footsteps came closer to where Lee was hiding. "The Blackwell Foundation employs hundreds of people today. Our hospital treats thousands. Would you destroy all that for the sake of justice for people who died over a century ago?" The footsteps stopped just inches from where Lee lay. If Patricia looked down between the coffins, she would be discovered. "I'm not unreasonable, Dr. Winters. We can come to an arrangement. Your research could be funded for years to come. All you need to do is walk away from this particular project." Lee held her breath, mind racing. The evidence she'd already photographed needed to get out, regardless of what happened to her. But to do that, she needed to escape this chamber, and Patricia Reynolds, I've created part 4 of the story, bringing Lee's investigation to a dramatic climax with the discovery of the hidden chamber. This section intensifies the narrative through a tense nighttime journey through the cemetery and catacombs, the discovery of 12 coffins containing the remains of missing workers, damning documentary evidence of Blackwell's deliberate murders, and cover-up, the contrasting shrine to Blackwell's public image alongside his victims, Patricia's unexpected arrival, creating immediate danger and a cliffhanger ending. The narrative maintains an engaging pace with vivid descriptions and building tension. I've kept the language accessible while conveying the emotional weight of Lee's discoveries. The story remains human-centered by focusing on the victims' fates and Lee's determination to expose the truth, despite personal risk. Would you like me to make any adjustments to Part 4? Or would you prefer I continue with the final Part 5 of the story? Retry T-Key'll create the final Part 5 of This Tomb Hides a Tragic Truth You Can't Ignore following your guidelines. Approximately 1,400 words with simple language, engaging storytelling, and appropriate content for YouTube. Type, share, text, markdown, title. This Tomb Hides a Tragic Truth You Can't Ignore, Part 5. The beam of Patricia's flashlight swept across the chamber, passing just inches above where Lee lay hidden between the coffins. Lee's muscles cramped from staying so still, but she didn't dare move. This is becoming tiresome, Dr. Winters, Patricia sighed, moving toward the desk. I know you're in here somewhere. As Patricia rifled through the papers on the desk, Lee carefully slid her phone from her pocket. Making sure the sound and flash were off, she positioned it to capture Patricia in the hidden chamber. If anything happened to her tonight, there would at least be evidence of who was involved. Patricia picked up the ledger Lee had been examining. Ah, I see you found the list. Unfortunate, but not unexpected. She spoke casually, as if discussing nothing more serious than overdue library books. Edward Blackwell wasn't a perfect man, but his vision built this town. Sometimes progress requires sacrifices. Lee's finger pressed the camera button, silently capturing Patricia's damning admission. The Blackwell family has protected this secret for generations, Patricia continued, still searching the room for signs of Lee. My grandmother was Edward's great-niece. She understood what was at stake. The foundation, the hospital, the library, all built on Blackwell money. Would you destroy all that over some long-dead factory workers? Patricia moved to the row of coffins, running her hand along the top of one. Lee pressed herself flatter, against the floor, hardly daring to breathe. They were troublemakers, you know. Agitators. In today's terms, we might call them union organizers. Patricia's laugh was cold. They threatened everything Edward had built. He did what he had to do. Just as Patricia was about to look between the coffins where Lee was hiding, a noise came from the passageway, the sound of the outer door creaking open. Patricia's head snapped toward the entrance. Who's there? She called sharply. Heavy footsteps approached, and Frank appeared in the doorway, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. What are you doing here? Patricia demanded. Frank's weathered face was grim. I figured you'd follow Dr. Winters here. Thought she might need backup. Patricia's hand moved to her coat pocket. This doesn't concern you, Frank. You're just the groundskeeper. Go back to your rounds. My grandfather died in Blackwell's factory, Frank said, stepping further into the chamber. So did a lot of other people's grandparents. Some just disappeared. This concerns me plenty. Lee seized the distraction to roll silently away from her hiding spot and behind a filing cabinet. From this new position, she could see Patricia had pulled something from her pocket, the metallic glint of a small handgun. The Historical Society appreciates your years of service, Patricia said coldly, raising the weapon, but your employment is hereby terminated. Before Patricia could pull the trigger, Lee sprang up and swung her heavy flashlight, striking Patricia's arm. The gun clattered to the floor as Patricia cried out in pain and surprise. Frank lunged forward, pinning Patricia against the wall while Lee grabbed the fallen weapon. Let me go! You have no idea what you're doing! Patricia struggled against Frank's grip. I know exactly what we're doing, Lee said, breathing hard. We're exposing a century-old cover-up and bringing justice to 12 murdered workers. And who will pay for your precious justice? Patricia spat. The hospital wing that treats children with cancer? The scholarship fund for low-income students? All Blackwell Foundation money. Blood money, Frank growled. The Foundation can survive the truth, Lee said firmly. Those families deserve to know what happened to their ancestors, and this town deserves to know its real history, not the sanitized version you've been protecting. Keeping the gun trained on Patricia, Lee retrieved her backpack and pulled out a length of nylon rope she'd brought for navigating the catacombs. Frank, can you secure her hands? We need to get all this evidence out of here. As Frank bound Patricia's wrists, Lee quickly gathered the most important documents: the ledger, Blackwell's journal, and the letters from workers. Her phone contained photos of everything else. What are you going to do with me? Patricia asked, her confident demeanor finally cracking. Call the police, Lee said simply. Trespassing, threatening us with a deadly weapon. That should keep you occupied while we get this evidence to the right people. The right people, Patricia scoffed. The mayor, the police chief, the newspaper editor, all sit on the Blackwell Foundation board. Nobody in this town will help you. Lee and Frank exchanged looks. Patricia might be right about local officials, but Lee had other resources. Then we'll go beyond this town, Lee said. I have colleagues at the State Historical Preservation Office, friends in national media. This story is too big to bury again. They led Patricia back through the catacombs, emerging into the cemetery where the night air felt shockingly fresh after the staleness underground. Frank called the police on his cell phone, reporting an intruder with a weapon at the cemetery. While they waited for the authorities, Lee transferred all the photos from her phone to a secure cloud storage account, then sent copies to her university department head with a brief explanation. No matter what happened next, the evidence was safe. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The local police, as Patricia had predicted, seemed reluctant to pursue serious charges against such a prominent citizen, but the evidence Lee had gathered was too compelling to ignore entirely. The discovery of human remains on private property triggered an automatic investigation by the state police, who were less entangled with local politics. The hidden chamber was thoroughly documented by forensic teams. DNA testing was ordered for the remains, though matching century-old DNA to living descendants would be challenging. The town buzzed with rumors and speculation as news of the discovery leaked out. 5 days after the confrontation in the tomb, Lee sat in the small office of the town's newspaper editor, a young woman named Riley who had only recently taken over the paper from her retired father. So you're actually going to print the story? Lee asked, not bothering to hide her surprise. Riley nodded, her expression determined. The Sentinel has been in my family for 3 generations. My great-grandfather sold out to Blackwell back in the 1870s, started printing whatever Blackwell told him to print. She tapped the stack of evidence on her desk. This is my chance to set that right. You might lose advertisers, Lee warned. The Foundation has a lot of influence. Riley shrugged. Probably, but we'll gain readers. People are tired of having their history sanitized. The story ran the next morning, covering the entire front page with the headline, Hidden Chamber Beneath Blackwell Tomb Reveals Century of Wahhabi Lies. The article detailed Edward Blackwell's systematic elimination of workers who opposed him, the cover-up orchestrated by the Historical Society, and the discovery of the 12 victims. It included photographs of the chamber and excerpts from Blackwell's own incriminating journal. The town's reaction was mixed. Some residents, particularly those with ties to the Foundation, denounced the story as sensationalism that would damage the town's economy. Others, especially descendants of factory workers, expressed relief that the truth had finally come out. Mr. Bell from the workers' neighborhood organized a memorial service at the cemetery, where dozens of families gathered, to honor the 12 victims and others who had suffered under Blackwell's reign. Frank ensured the area around the tomb was respectfully maintained for the ceremony. 2 weeks after the revelation, Lee sat with Mr. Bell on his porch, sharing the latest developments. The Foundation board voted to reorganize, she told him. They're changing the name and redirecting their mission to focus on worker safety and education. Patricia resigned along with several board members who opposed the changes. Never thought I'd see the day, Mr. Bell said, shaking his head in wonder. My grandfather would have been grateful. The State Historical Preservation Office is taking over the tomb, Lee continued. They're planning to create an exhibit about the workers and the true history of the town's industrial development. The remains will be properly buried with markers bearing their names. In the distance, the setting sun cast long shadows over the town, including the old factories that had once been Blackwell's empire. Most stood empty now, abandoned as manufacturing had moved overseas decades ago. But one was being renovated as a museum of industrial history, telling the complete story, both the innovation and the human cost. "What about you?" Mr. Bell asked. "Heading back to the university?" Lee smiled. "Eventually. The State Preservation Office offered me a temporary position to oversee the tomb project. I'd like to see it through." "Good," he nodded. "Stories like this need proper endings." As twilight deepened into night, Lee thought about the 12 workers whose disappearance had been a mystery for over a century. Their names would now be known, their fates acknowledged, their humanity restored. The magnificent tomb that Edward Blackwell had built to glorify himself would instead stand as a monument to a truth he had tried desperately to hide: that no empire built on suffering can truly be called great, and no secret stays buried forever. The town would never be the same, but perhaps, Lee reflected, that was exactly as it should be. I've created the final part 5 of the story, bringing Lee's investigation to a satisfying conclusion, while resolving the immediate danger and broader historical injustice. This conclusion provides a tense resolution to the cliffhanger with Frank's timely arrival, and Lee's quick thinking shows the consequences for Patricia and addresses her claims about the town's dependence on the foundation, depicts realistic challenges of bringing such a long-buried truth to light, including resistance from local authorities, introduces Riley, a newspaper editor with her own family connection to the story, as an ally in publishing. The truth shows the community's mixed but evolving response and the beginning of healing through acknowledgement and memorialization. The narrative maintains an engaging pace while providing emotional closure. I've kept the language accessible and focused on human experiences throughout. The victims' families finding closure, Mr. Bell witnessing justice for his grandfather, and Lee seeing her dangerous investigation make a meaningful difference. 3. Ending balances acknowledging the tragedy with a sense of hope and restoration, making it appropriate for YouTube while still honoring the serious nature of the historical injustices depicted. Is there anything you'd like me to adjust or modify about this final part of the story?